I think we underestimated how challenging it would be to bring everyone back in once we let you free. So I think, just as a quick note, the plan is, we really appreciated the questions that all of you had. I think it was a really rich discussion. We'd like to be able to have a bit more time for that at the end. So what we'd like to do is perhaps keep the breakout sessions a little bit shorter, have about 20 minutes for each session, and then we'll be able to bring everyone back together for about 25 more minutes at the end for additional questions, if that sounds good to everyone. Oh, yeah, please help me, Leslie. Perfect. Okay, so while Leslie is logging us back in, I just wanted to quickly introduce our speakers for the Decarbonization Research Lightning Talks. First up, we'll have Rob Metcalfe, who is an associate professor and applied microeconomist at the University of Southern California. So today, Rob is going to be reviewing kind of a collection of his research projects that he's been conducting to date, some of which are JPAL projects. So he'll be, I think, giving a wide range of examples of the types of experimental research that he has underway. Erica Myers will be presenting next. She's an associate professor of economics at the University of Calgary, and she holds the Canada Research Chair in Environmental, Energy, and Resource Economics. And Erica is going to be discussing setting a research agenda for consumer-driven climate change mitigation. And then I think Patrick Baylis is going to close us off. He is an assistant professor and environmental economist at the University of British Columbia. And as Bruce previously mentioned, Patrick, as well as Judson, are currently conducting a randomized evaluation on a wildfire risk and self-protective investment intervention in Jackson County out in Oregon, working with implementing partner Fire District 3. So this research project was supported through a JPAL North America State and Local Innovation Initiative Evaluation Incubator, which is a mouthful. So from there, I will turn it over to Rob.
Cool. Thanks, Aaron, and thanks, Peter, for putting today's schedule together and having me. I'm just going to talk really briefly about sort of the experiments I've got going on right now in decarbonization and the experiments that I plan to do in the next 12 to 24 months. Recently, I've become the chief economist of the Center for Net Zero of Octopus Energy Group, which is a private entity based in the UK, but it has it owns utilities in a range of countries. And so a lot of my work right now is thinking about some of the things that was discussed in the questions and by Erica in terms of external mobility is like, can we do the same experiment, the same treatment across multiple countries at the same time and get these elasticities and see how different or similar they are. So I would say most of my work published so far has been done with no financial support. So it's really great that JPAL is here and willing to try to broker and support academics because it's really hard. I got a lot of battle scars from trying to start a lot of experiments. The paper that I wrote with Virgin Atlantic a couple of years ago that was published in the JP, I had the idea, I sent the idea to 35 different airlines through LinkedIn by myself, and only one responded, and that was Virgin Atlantic. And like that was the paper. I got very lucky, but to have someone like JPAL come in and start to do these connections is worth its weight in gold, to be honest, in my opinion. So, sorry. Yeah. I can make sounds, but I can play a tune if you want. Sorry. Oh, okay. Okay, cool. So over the last sort of 5-10 years, I've sort of developed good relationships with SoCalGas and SoCal Edison. Both have head offices in LA, and I published some papers on thinking about sort of energy efficiency. Energy efficiency equity trade-offs, and that's led to them, drinking the Kool-Aid on experimentation. So now they do experiments in a lot of different areas. They're an investor-owned utility, so they're regulated by the PUC. And that's something that's let to chat more about in the questions is, how can we convince the PUCs to run an evaluation through academics rather than consultants? Like Nexent gets paid $250,000 to do a measurement and validation of any energy efficiency program in California, for example. So like, how can JPAL get in that door, in that stage? I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion to have. But I've convinced them to do stuff that's like outside of measurement and evaluation that's done by the PUC. So I've done some stuff with SoCal Edison on time of use experiments, how to get people on the time of use, how to get them to be more elastic and switching, and then thinking about sort of what is the switching models that people go from like a standard variable rate to time of use. SoCal Gas doing a bunch of experiments on like debt forgiveness, on energy efficiency, and a whole bunch of stuff right now on sort of payment methods and weatherization. Again, like they both have kind of like believed that experiments are really helpful for them to make decisions, but they're a vested on utility. They're a monopolist. So like the incentives are not really strong for them to do experiments. It's been just building great rapport with them, and them liking me liking them, and having some sort of mutual beneficial agreement that we can sort of help each other through the design of experiments. None of these have been funded. I just convinced the utilities to do them themselves. So that's California, what I'm doing right there. So I moved to, not moved, but like I joined the Center for Net Zero Octopus Energy Group, which has utility customers in many major countries. And my role there is to try to think about what experiments they should be running to think about the most efficient and equitable way to get to a decarbonized grid. So this group is kind of like independent from the utility in the sense of the objectives are not for profit. The objectives is to do academic research that will help us understand the evidence base for 2030, 2040, 2050 of getting to a decarbonized grid. So, and like some of the backers of Octopus Energy Group are Al Gore, and there's a lot of people who have sort of split shareholder incentives between profit and the environment. So we've run a bunch of experiments so far on like peak demand. So in the UK, there's been many instances over the last year where the price of a megawatt hour being generated is about £4,000. So they've actually gone onto the market and say, hey, we will pay utilities £4,000 for 1 megawatt hour reduction. How can you do that? So we've run experiments on giving incentives and then randomizing like how much time do we give them. So like utilities of the future are going to be interested in seeing how you can get that short-term response and how much time do you give people to make a change in what they're going to consume tomorrow at 5 p.m., for example. The further away you give the notice period, the more uncertainty about whether it's actually going to be a peak time, but the more time people can plan. But the more closer you get to a potential peak time period, the more certain the grid and the utility know it's a peak time. And so the closer you get, the better you can spend the money, but people can prepare. So we've randomized exactly when people are given the information. So that'll be coming out probably soon as a paper. JPAL, very kindly funded project. I'll be in the field this winter on, I think Octopus has the largest customer base for EVs in the UK. Many of them are not on an EV tariff. It's called Intelligent Octopus, which actually manages your charging to charge during the nighttime that minimizes the cost of the utility and the cost of the environment. And so we're going to randomize the prices to move on to that and randomizes the price to not opt out of that as well. So we'll have like hopefully an elasticity on the extensive margin and then on the intensive margin as well. So we do that, and then we're going to the experiment we ran with about 700,000 people over the last winter on peak time. We'll do that for about 3 million people this winter, but we'll test more interesting things beyond just information and incentives. So these are the kind of projects that are in the pipeline to do over the next year or two. Not necessarily all agreed, but this is this type of stuff that I'm interested in doing with Octopus across those 6 countries that I mentioned, is just getting the elasticities for adoption of low carbon technologies, and then seeing how those low carbon technologies impact on usage over time. And then how does low carbon technologies, how can they be managed for the grid to be efficient and equitable? That's the kind of like the big questions that I'm working on right now at Octopus Energy Group. And some of them have like an equity flavor to them, but most of them are thinking about that interaction between technology and prices. Obviously, like, been some great work on that so far, like Dave's work, for example. And what's nice about Octopus is like they have the ability to randomize different types of tariffs. There's some regulation in the UK of what tariffs you can provide, but you can do beta tariffs. And so we are trying to think about, can we get tariffs that move us closer to local marginal pricing? Octopus really wants to get there. The regulators do not want to get there, so we are trying to see what we can do on that. So there's a lot of interesting stuff by being inside a utility that I wouldn't have known about. There's new innovations being done, and so all of these are interesting to policymakers, but I'm doing it from the side of inside a company and figuring out how to get these elasticities. Low carbon transit, so I'm currently working with BART and MTC in the Bay Area. I've done a paper on randomizing like off-peak subsidies to shift people from the peak to the off-peak and how that can impact on a range of different outcomes. Again, this is not a funded project. They do that themselves. I just help them design it. And then we have got a large 150,000 student RCT right now in the Bay Area, a 2-year experiment where students are randomized into free transit across the whole of the Bay Area. And we get to see where they live, how they commute, and see, does having free transit change where they live? Does it change how they use BART? Does it change their academic performance? This is all Berkeley, Stanford, San Francisco University students. So that's in the field. So hopefully this doesn't get out in the public, this video, and hopefully no one knows about it. We're doing work on maritime emissions as well. So the work I did in aviation, I created a company that sort of scaled it up to aviation, but now there's interest in maritime. So this is actually a JPAL-funded project where we'll actually do a large RCT with a very large shipping company where we randomize captains to receive different management practices and see how that impacts on their way that they manage their ships, which is quite a lot. And we've done like an 8km model on the ship captain fixed effects and how it explains overall variation in fuel use, and it's about 15% of the captain fixed effects explain 15% of the variance in fuel use. It's a huge margin. Things that I would love to experiment in transit side that I haven't, and hopefully with Maggie joining and Aaron being interested in this area, is thinking about sort of cross-price elasticities across modes, value of time across modes. I've done one paper with Lyft on rideshare, but that was wait time, not value of time in the modes. That would be cool to do. I would love to randomize infrastructure, like where are stations and how does that impact on the decisions that people make about how they use public transit. I haven't really seen a really good paper on the value of reliability experimentally. So I would love, and that's obviously like in a lot of Ken Small's work, that's a huge parameter for why people have certain types of transit. So I would love to be able to randomize reliability. And then the value of green transit options. So I'm trying to do work with some of the rideshare companies of seeing what's the price premium for people to take green transit as opposed to not. But anyways, those are the things I would love to do in the public transit space that I think would add a lot to how policymakers make decisions in this area. We get some really cool elasticities. And then lastly, I'm doing like this big project with Nathan Hendren. I think he's part of JPAL now officially. Bob Hahn and Ben Sprang-Kaiser, where we have looked at the literature the last 30 years and taken all the elasticities that come out of all the tax and the subsidy papers and put that into a sort of a unified welfare framework using the marginal value of public funds. The marginal value of public funds is just the societal benefits divided by the change in net government cost. And so why that's different from benefit cost ratios is because how you close the budget constraint, that's totally open. So there's no deadweight loss of how you raise the money. And any fiscal externalities with the change in the policy goes in the denominator, not the numerator, so you can figure out what are the Pareto improvements with any policies. So we're doing this for all of the, all like 300 papers in the top field and the top 5 journals of the last 30 years. And thinking like, where is the incidence of the benefits and costs for those like inside the US and outside the US. And it's like, when we've gone through this literature, we just don't know that much about stuff that's happening today. So we couldn't really do much of an evaluation a really good evaluation on the IRA, because we just don't have elasticities for many of this stuff. Like production tax credits, like we're using elasticities that I don't think many of you in the room would believe comes from a credible identification strategy. And so, but the production tax credits in our evaluation of the IRA seems to be the kind of the best thing from a marginal value public funds for helping the environment. So we just need like a lot more, like, and Peter mentioned it, Erin mentioned it, and Bruce mentioned it. We just need a lot more research on the various parts of the IRA. And I don't know how we're can do this experimentally, quasi-experimentally, or with some, state by state or county by county variation maybe, but like, I think that's a big ticket area. Could we actually experimentally vary the PTC? Like that would be a huge paper. That would help so much, because that seems to be the big tickets in the IRA that will do the most good. So I'm hopefully that JPAL can help with this endeavor of whether the government's going to spend $392 billion or they're going to spend $1,200 billion. That's a huge range that Catherine mentioned yesterday. Whether it be 1,200 or 392 depends on the elasticities. And we just don't know. And it's kind of like, and I think Robert in his comments to Catherine yesterday is like, what is the next thing that's going to happen down the road? What can we say that we should do? And like, honestly, I just couldn't advise anything because we have no elasticities for a lot of the big stuff in the IRA. So I'm really excited of how JPAL can really help us think about getting at really cool elasticities from the spending in the IRA, and that'll help us understand where we should go in the next 10, 20 years as we get further into decarbonizing the grid. So I think I'm out of time. So thank you all for your patience. Thank you. Am I taking questions now or later, or not at all? No, you have 5 minutes. Yeah, 5 minutes? You sure? Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any, but we can just move on to Erica if not.
Maybe just a curiosity question. When you talk about Octopus Energy, so you do experiment in the UK, but what are the customer base in other countries? Like, I guess it's big in the UK, but is it big also in Italy, Spain, France? Or?
Yeah. So what we want to do is just like each of the for example, with the peak time demand, all these countries have to some extent like peak time problems, and so one of the things that we're trying to do is we are having it's called a saving session in the UK. And we're taking the concept to all of these countries and like randomizing the price for turning down.
But I mean customers, because I guess they are pretty big in the UK, but I know, for example, in France, they roll out with very small.
Yeah. Yeah, like in the US, it's only TXU, which is about like 40,000 customers. But I should say, I don't know how much I can say, they are taking over more and more customers in every country. So we'll get to a point of a critical mass that we'll be able to do more interesting stuff within each country and compare that to the 5 million customers we have in the UK that have an account with Octopus. It's challenging because obviously there's local partners in each of these countries who do and do not want to do certain stuff. So there's a lot of negotiation and rapport building you got to do. But that's for me quite exciting to think about, how do these elasticities vary across countries with the exact same price changes, with the exact same information. And so I'm quite excited about that.
Just a follow-up question on that. Are you looking primarily at residential customers, or are you looking at industrial customers? And if the latter, can you look at like how particular sectors are able to respond, because they are such enormous electricity users, and I would hope that some of them can turn off and some of them can't. Yeah. And you might be able to do studies across countries as well.
Yeah, so they don't have a large like C&I customer base. It's mainly residential that they have, unfortunately. But the one thing that we are, I think they have I think Octopus has like 75,000 customers commercial customers in the UK. So we can do some stuff, but it's not going to be really, really well powered. But I don't know how much I can say. There is going to be like a tariff that tries to get commercial to do more stuff with solar, and Yeah, so there's some things in the works, but I don't know how much we can do with just 75,000 customers right now on the C&I in the UK. But I agree, like it's I would love to do more. They are going to do stuff on the supply side. I don't know exactly how much I can push them, so we put an idea of like randomizing incentives for increasing wind capacity in the UK. So we're gonna try and do that, not in the US because we just don't have enough sample size. But I'm definitely with you that I would love to do more in the C&I space because like that's where there's a large potential for a lot of savings.
I guess I was wondering how Octopus is currently thinking about, the equitable way part of this. That's in my view, that's an open question. Everybody's got some ideas about them. I think there's some good ideas out there, but to what extent is that? How is that operationalized? I guess.
Yeah. There's no like, there's no like clear like short-term profit reasons to do that. There are good public policy reasons to do that, but at CNZ we want to actually generate some evidence of how we get like the bottom 50% to like engage in this stuff because they don't engage in most energy efficiency stuff. And one of the things is like the virtual power plants, because in the UK a lot of low-income people live in like terraced homes, so all the homes are all the buildings are connected together. So you can actually put like solar across the top of it all, and then try to manage like how do people actually use energy in a way that would minimize taking energy from the grid. So there's some like it's challenging. It's challenging. It's not clear that even like even in the US, like the PUCs push the IOUs to do stuff like this, and then it's not necessarily in the interest of the IOUs. So, but I care about it, and I think as policymakers care about it, I think the utility should care about it. So that's kind of my stance on that. Thank you all for the question, by the way. This is great. Thank you.
So, I mean, it's a super impressive group of experiments, and I've told you this before. I'm always blown away by the number of really cool, high-impact projects you're able to do at the same time. And I will say, Patrick and I have been developing this field experiment that Patrick's going to talk about in a minute with a lot of help from Jay Powell. The research management support has been great, and Claire has been helping us, and she's here, and she's been great. But it's still been a ton of work. And I just wonder, do you have anything you've learned as you've scaled things up that has been particularly helpful for making your time more valuable, or figuring out how to leverage or multiply your time with inputs that, how do you do it?
It's a good question. Trying to thread the needle between what's a win for the company and what's the win for like academic research and what's the win for policy is a very small, tight needle to thread. And maybe I've just been lucky in threading that needle. And all those projects that I mentioned, all the stuff I'm doing, has that like trifecta of a win-win-win. I don't know necessarily why, but like these companies do also like are interested in the academic research. But then I think we'll discuss this later on. It's certain people in certain organizations don't care and they won't do it. And like I would say my denominator of how many like teams and people I've asked is huge. And so like I just ask a lot of people a lot of time to do stuff, and eventually I'll either like grind them down or figure out that they are interested in it or not, and just get into yes as quickly as possible. I think is like to save you time and effort. I think that's the biggest thing. But it's just like, I don't know, it's taking the lens of that organization and then saying, okay, like what do they care about, and how would you as an academic care about that? And I think that's what I've tried to do. This one.
So I think I'm going to drill down on an element that Jed was asking about that you didn't answer, which is literally like your time. where are you investing it? Are you investing it in design? Are you investing it in like the day-to-day meetings of developing and running the experiments? Are you investing in like manuscript preparation? And like, is there a team within your lab at school, or are you mainly using like human resources at the companies? Because like Judd, and I think like a lot of people here, I'm interested in like the on the ground of what this looks like for you.
Yeah, so not in Octopus, but outside of Octopus, all my research before, I've never had an RA, never had a postdoc. I've convinced the company to run it. And I design it with them, and it takes a lot of time in the design and how you do the implementation. So I spend a lot of time on that phase, and then they go off and implement it in the hope of good faith that they implemented it well. Obviously, they'll do some checks to make sure they have. I'll do the randomization for them. I'll do some checks on whether it was implemented with good fidelity, like a random audit kind of check. But then I'll let the experiment go. And like a lot of my stuff is like, in energy demand, like it's hard to publish stuff with say less than like 3 months worth of data these days. So like I let the experiment go for a year and then come back to the company in a year's time with the data and then do the analysis. So that's before. With Octopus now, I have a team that does everything for me, but I help them on the design and then matching the design to policy. I think that's where I spend most of my time today anyway. Yeah, I think that's it. When I was younger and less experienced, it was definitely a lot of like LinkedIn and a lot of sending emails and a lot of just like asking people. Less today. I've got probably too much stuff to do. So, but I think as a young researcher, I spent a lot of time on those meetings, like flying around. Probably not great. Flying around the country, meeting them face to face because that matters. Building rapport, them trusting you. I think that's huge. In doing field experiments and partnerships. So before COVID, I was definitely, just meeting people face to face and trying to get good rapport. And but that's less so now. It's more of like just designing stuff with organizations. But I wish I had like a great like formula for this stuff. It's just like it feels like so haphazard of how I done it. You know, it's just like I don't know, just constant like just doing stuff. Yeah, it's challenging. It's really challenging. I wish I had a formula and a good answer for that, but it's hard. It's hard. I've been told my British accent gets me 10% of the way there, so maybe in the US that's been helpful, you know. So maybe get a British accent, maybe like go to the UK for a year and just spend some time and then come back, you know. And so, okay, thanks for all your questions. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little more broadly about what I think are interesting questions in the space of consumer behavior and climate mitigation, which is where I do a lot of my research. So there's a recent report done by the International Energy Agency, the IEA, where they tried to model what would it take to get to this ambitious goal of net zero by 2050. And they categorized interventions into two different types. Those are going to require a lot of policy support, a lot of investment, but not necessarily any direct consumer engagement. So those are things like replacing fossil fuels with carbon-free energy sources, expanding transmission to support renewable development. And then another type of interventions, which are ones that are going to require some type of direct consumer engagement. So those are things like energy efficiency improvements, electrification, flexible demand. And interestingly, it was this latter category of interventions that they project more of the savings are going to come through. And there's consensus across all major US net zero models that all three of these things are going to be huge contributors to our path to net zero. And I think there's just very little known about how best to promote this. So this is an area that I think is super ripe for research right now. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the building sector, which I'm calling a sleeping giant here because I think it's often out of sight, out of mind when people are thinking about deep decarbonization. Usually on the top of people's minds are the transportation sector or industry. But just interestingly, buildings contribute as much to greenhouse gas emissions as either of those two. So in this same IEA report, they projected that 85% of housing is going to have to be net zero ready by 2050. So, or not housing, sorry, buildings. So that's going to mean that buildings have been retrofitted for energy efficiency and they're electrified and ready to go. And so to get there, 2 to 2.5% of the building stock is going to need to be retrofitted worldwide every single year. So there's just a huge set of retrofits that are going to have to happen pretty quickly. And energy efficiency is often on the front lines of any major modeling effort that's trying to project how do we get to net zero. And the reason is if it's done cost effectively, then it can actually be the lowest cost means to reduce carbon emissions. And what do I mean by cost effective? I mean, are there investments to be made where that flow of savings over the lifetime of the investment more than outweigh the upfront costs? And if we have opportunities like that, then we're getting carbon reductions at zero or negative costs. As everyone in the room, I assume, is well aware, there's been a lot of recent research, though, showing that there are often these discrepancies, as we talked about this morning, between projected savings, often through engineering estimates, and what's realized on the ground. And that's in weatherization home retrofits, appliance rebate programs, and in new efficient housing as well. And it's kind of caused economists to call into question the value or the efficacy of using energy efficiency as a low-cost means to reduce carbon emissions. And so I think the question is, like, are there ways to allocate resources differently where we can reliably achieve cost-effective reductions in this space? Because if we can, it's going to be a very low-cost way to achieve carbon mitigation. So that's something that I've looked into with Peter in a series of research papers that we've done together. And the first step in thinking about this is just what's causing that wedge between projected and realized savings. So for that, we paired with the Weatherization Assistance Program, which is the US's largest federal energy efficiency program. It's aimed at helping low-income consumers. And the different mechanisms that we looked at are engineering model bias, or these models just really bad, quality of workmanship, and then we also looked at occupant behavior, which almost always comes up with policymakers when you talk about this discrepancy, which is this idea that, well, if we make it less expensive for people to heat their homes, maybe they're just heating it more and they're more comfortable. And interestingly, what we found is that the largest drivers of this wedge are the engineering and model bias and workmanship, whereas this occupant behavior is sort of smaller. But we think that this is going to have much wider external validity because the same engineering models are being used to project savings from energy efficiency investments across the vast majority of energy efficiency programs, and the same worker incentives are present as well. So I'm going to highlight two studies that we did to sort of dig into this further. The first is we wanted to see if we could improve workmanship through modifying worker incentives. So rather than paying workers simply to complete the job with some type of inspection, we decided to pay workers based on an outcome of the job. And what we used was building envelope tightness. And we used that instead of energy consumption because it's something that is already measured as part of the program. You can measure it immediately after completing the job. And it's related just to the structure of the house. So the behavior of the people inside, like if they went on vacation or something like that, can't get affected. And importantly, it's also highly correlated with energy savings. And this picture shows how they measure it. You basically put a seal over the front door and then try to suck air out of the home. And the more resistance you get to that, the tighter the building envelope. It means that air isn't leaking through cracks around the windows or things like that. And we found that this was incredibly cost effective. So we spent about $200 per house, and we increased the energy savings by 25% per home. So we got a return of $5 to $14 in social benefits for every dollar invested. And in the case of our program, it actually flipped the sign on whether the net benefits were negative or positive. Another study that we did was looking into this issue of model bias. So what this graph is showing is the net benefits that we estimated for each home in the Illinois implementation of the Weatherization Assistance Program for about 10 years. And they're ranked from lowest to highest net present benefits. And so our research question was twofold. Well, first, before I go into that, and these were supposed to all be cost effective. Okay, so according to the engineering models, these were all going to be cost effective. And what we wanted to know is, using data from already weatherized homes, can we more accurately predict what the future savings are going to be? And then second, what would be the gains from allocating funds according to this potentially more accurate model versus the status quo? And so what we found is, indeed, we can do a much better job. We use machine learning, but it turns out you don't really need to. I mean, the big thing you need is just billing data from similar homes to get on-the-ground savings. And we found an increase in social net benefits of 21%, from 93 cents to more than $1 per dollar spent. And this was using a social cost of carbon of $51, and it would probably be much larger using like closer to $200, like what we're considering today. So I think there are a lot of lessons from energy efficiency that carry over for electrification. First is that work quality can have a large effect on outcomes. There was a study done by the US government looking into this, where they suggested that improper installation practices could lead to increases in energy consumption by almost 30%. So it could be very important in that space as well. To the extent, again, that we have differences between modeled and realized energy consumption, that has important implications for climate policy accounting. Like Peter was saying, we want to be able to show up to international agreements and know that we're getting the savings we think we are. But also for cost effectiveness, when we're comparing, like, where should we spend dollars? Should we spend it on electrification and heat pumps versus other things? We want to make sure we get those numbers right. So I think there's a lot of important and unanswered electrification questions. It's a very new technology, very little work has been done. So even the most basic impact evaluations of on-the-ground consumption, how that compares to projections, what are the prevalence of different faults in installation, and best practices for elimination, and setting up contracts so that the incentives align what the workers are doing with what policymakers want, et cetera. So, and then, yeah, importantly, I'll just skip to the bottom here. I think that a really important area for work is in commercial and multi-unit residential, because almost all the work that I've seen in energy efficiency space has been in single-family residential. And then finally, I think another area that's very ripe for research in terms of getting consumer engagement to reduce carbon emissions is through flexible demand. So Rob's already got a lot of experiments going in this area. But obviously, this is going to require getting people to reduce energy consumption during peak hours. It's going to require coordinating actions across many different households. But the problem is that these opportunities can be irregular, and they can sort of result in being these low-stakes opportunities that amount to picking up pennies. And so when you've got irregular, low-stake opportunities, automation is going to really be key. So what's it going to take to get people to take up the technology needed to do this? To what extent are they going to be comfortable ceding control to automation, and how do we best promote that? Okay. I tried to send an updated version of this slide last night, but it didn't make it into the deck. So yeah, so it was a graphic of what a virtual power plant looks like. So this kind of coordinated effort is sometimes known as a virtual power plant. And basically, consumers are ceding control of things like smart thermostats, rooftop solar PV, their electric vehicles, distributed batteries, smart water heaters, commercial building automation systems, et cetera, to a central aggregator who's then managing demand, and then it really reduces the cost of utilities. So this was a study done by the Brattle Group, and they found that they could save US utilities $15 to $35 billion in investment capacity over 10 years. So there's just a really big opportunity there, I think. And I want to highlight briefly some work being done by some of my colleagues at the University of Calgary, where they found that centralized control can lead to really big gains. So what they did is they worked with a utility in Canada. They recruited people to participate in their experiment and randomized them into 3 groups to respond to peak load. A central group where the utility is reducing consumption on the consumer's behalf during particular events. And the technologies that they were able to manage remotely was EV chargers, baseboard thermostats, and water heaters. And then they had a tech group, which they gave the same remote control technology to consumers as the utility was using. They just had to go into the app and turn that on. And then finally a manual group where they were still given rewards to reduce consumption, but no enabling technology. So they would have to like go around their house and mess with their water heater settings or things like that. And there's 2 big takeaways from their study. The first one is that take-up was not that different between the central group and the tech group. So when we're thinking about like resistance to automation, it didn't seem very large, at least for this sample that they recruited of eager beavers. But then secondly, this central group just blew the other 2 groups out of the water. So I think this is a really telling result, that even the group that you gave them this enabling technologies, they actually went into your house and attached devices to your water heater or attached devices to your level 2 charger and things like that. Still, people were not engaging with it to do much better than the manual group. Okay, so here too, I think there are also many important unanswered questions, hopefully not unanswerable, about flexible demand. And just thinking about how best to encourage adoption of these controllable devices. How do we design apps? What are the best defaults? I think a really big issue is going to be encouraging scrapping of internal combustion cars when people do adopt EVs, especially because we know that cars get dirtier over their lifetimes. And just, yeah, again, I'll skip down to the bottom, is just thinking about like, this is a big challenge, I think, for our community, is we're trying to think about this future when everything's electrified, but the people that we can recruit into our studies and get onto the apps now are these super eager beaver people that might be really different than the wider community. So how are we going to think about external validity to the future? So this is just sort of a summary of what I just said, and given time, I'll end there.
I'm just curious about like municipal microgrids, sort of along the lines of a virtual power plant, but at a larger scale. Just like any thoughts you have on that? Like, are answerable research questions that you see? But there's plenty of barriers to getting that done. I think to have the kind of like energy generating and storing and like distributing at a like municipal or like bigger level. I'm just so interested. It seems helpful for resilience and like possible in some places in the world, but plenty of barriers. So just curious if you've thought much about that.
Yeah, I haven't thought too much about microgrids. In a lot of the areas I work, we have pretty reliable electric power. So it's general. I think like, yeah. Are you thinking about how that interacts with consumer behavior, or I guess? Yeah.
Oh, just like sort of as an area for efficiency. Thank you.
Okay.
If you're not like transmitting
I see.
energy, but the consumer behavior angle is more like adoption and like buy-in, if that makes sense. But that's getting a little far afield. Just sort of thinking about the virtual power plant elements and how that might scale to like a bigger system.
Yeah, I haven't thought too much about the microgrids. Yeah. Anyone?
So I think the energy modelers will continue to be an important part of just the way the conversation moves forward from the point of government. So in your experience, I found them to be very willing to update models as the science evolves. Is that, I think for both of you, have you found that the energy modelers are willing? Are we systematically communicating back to them that their models are overly optimistic on some things, and are that you're finding that they update as they feed that back down to the climate action planning process for local jurisdictions and all of that? Because I think that's an important feedback that we need to foment.
I agree. Yeah, that would be a great thing to engage JPL with. And I know Peter and I, at one point, we proposed a project where we were wanting to randomize how the individual retrofits were being chosen in an energy efficiency program, whether it be based on homes that looked similar in the past versus the engineering model, and how much could we improve the cost effectiveness. So there was some openness to doing that with this Illinois implementation. I've tried to make some headway in Canada. It's been a little bit harder. I do think sometimes within these organizations, there are like individual career concerns going on. You know, there's people who have their jobs and maybe this is their pet model, or there's always like some politics going on that's sometimes hard to navigate. I'm sure Rob's had a lot of experience trying to find the right person at the organization. But yeah, we haven't made too much headway beyond our current partner in Illinois, but we'd be very interested in moving that direction.
I would say there, though, I mean, there's a lot of reason for optimism. I mean,
Yeah.
was interest in updating. There's also capacity issues. So once you identify this is the way to potentially improve the model, now this question about continuity within the organization to implement that, to do that, it's not necessarily always our highest return project. So who does that? How does it come together? It's an important question to ask.
So I'm a big fan of this research agenda you guys have, and I think you're really shedding light on kind of the intricacies of what's working and not with energy efficiency. On your decomposition paper, where you find that 43%, I think it was, of the gap is from the modeling, errors in the modeling. I'm wondering, have you gone back to, you know, the climate mitigation models that use energy efficiency with, you know, presumably using the wrong numbers, and kind of have you written anything that kind of rethinks those based on the evidence that you found? Because I think that would be very high value add, and if you have done that, I've missed it, and I'd like to add it like to my syllabus.
Well, that's a great idea. We haven't done that, but I also would like to say that there is ways, I think, to reallocate resources, right? So I think, you know, in terms of thinking about like what's not cost effective, or like what is one of the prompts that we're going to think about, you know, after the Fally et al. Study, we saw that like in Michigan, during a few of the years in ARA, this program wasn't cost effective. And so we could throw up our hands and just say, okay, no one should be doing energy efficiency then. But it turns out, I think there are ways to maybe allocate resources differently. And we're realizing we're working with government agencies where there's a lot of misallocation going on, unsurprisingly. And so also sometimes trying to see how to make programs work might be a way to keep going with it.
Well, yeah, 100%. And I guess what I'm saying is you guys have provided some really novel insights about what can work and kind of what isn't working. And so these models that are relying heavily on energy efficiency investments, you know, should we be counting on 40% of the wedge to come from energy efficiency, or is that number more like 15% or 25%? Right. Can you kind of shed light by decomposing what they're assuming, you know, and filtering it through what you found in your research? Obviously, there are assumptions and all that, but I think that would be an extremely valuable public service.
Okay. Great idea. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Super interesting. Maybe connecting the last paper on automation and you're finding that workers, the quality of workers in energy efficiency retrofit is super important and not very supervised by consumers. I mean, connecting the two paper, can you back out an estimate of what the stakes have to be for direct end consumer engagement? Because it seems they don't care, but there has to be a level of stakes that make them care about it. So because you're talking about picking pennies, like, can you back out some estimate of, I mean, does it have to be a $200 saving, a $300 saving for direct engagement to start working, or?
That's a great question. yeah, hopefully that's something that Rob's experiments might speak to a little bit. Yeah, is like, what's the elasticity of people's willingness to engage based on different incentive levels? But I think that particular paper in Canada, they didn't randomize that too much.
Super interesting stuff. One quick question about the adoption of new technologies. Are you, like, there's a lot of funding coming for adoption of heat pumps and replacement of bad ACs, and now California with a lot of like the stove replacement. Are you working on something related to that, and are you thinking of incorporating some of the findings you've done to see the adoption of new technologies and how that improve energy efficiency?
I would love to. I only have one project right now in the pipeline, which Peter's talked a little bit about, where we're working with King County in Seattle area, and there we're hoping to randomize incentives for loans, basically. So can we give people lower rates by, guaranteeing to the bank that we'll repay or things like that. And what that does to uptake. But yeah, systematically, I think that would be a very ripe area to do research. Yeah. Oh, yeah. All right. Yeah, thanks.